Good morning, my students. Let us continue our lectures in Foundation of Economics. This is lecture 12, and we will continue in Principles of Macroeconomics, and we are going to specify this lecture for applied economics concepts. I'm Dr. Magda Mustafa Sadiq, Associate Professor in Applied Economics. So this lecture explains how economics theory offers powerful tools like supply, demand, opportunity cost, and comparative advantage to analyze real-world challenges in areas such as labor markets, international trade, climate change, and the shift to a zero-carbon economy using practical examples throughout. In today's lecture, we will explore how economic theory gives us a powerful framework to understand and analyze real-world issues, whether we are looking at how labor market function, how countries trade, or how we transition to a zero-carbon economy. Economic principles help us make sense of complex challenges. We will apply key concepts like supply and demand, opportunity cost, externalities, and comparative advantage to real-life examples, showing how these ideas are used in areas like international trade, climate economies, and knowledge-based economies. By the end of this lecture, you will see that economics is not just theory. It's a practical tool for solving today's most pressing problems. Let us start by looking at how economic theory helps us understand the labor market. Labor markets are where workers offer their skills and employers demand labor. And several key economic concepts help explain how this interaction works. Supply and demand. Weights, just like prices, are largely determined by the forces of supply and demand. The supply of labor comes from individuals willing to work. The demand for labor comes from employers needing workers. When demand for labor increases, say during economic expansion, wages tend to rise. But if there is an oversupply of labor, wages can stagnate for all. Human capital. Another important concept is human capital. The idea that education, skills, and experience increase a worker's productivity. The more skilled and educated a worker is, the higher their earning potential. That is why investment in education and training is so vital for individuals and the economy as a whole. Elasticity. Elasticity refers to how responsive labor supply or demand is to change in wages or conditions. If wages go up slightly and many more people are willing to work, supply is elastic. If employers quickly reduce hiring when wages increases, demand is elastic on their side. Understanding elasticity helps us predict how sensitive the labor market is to policy change. Market imperfections. Real-world labor markets aren't always perfect. Market imperfections can affect outcomes. Minimum wage laws can push wages above the market clearing level, potentially reducing employment. Unions may negotiate higher wages and better conditions, but can also influence labor cost. Discrimination based on gender, race, or other factors can distort fair wage distributions. These imperfections remind us that economic models need to be adjusted when applied to real labor markets. So economic theory helps us understand the mechanics and complexities of labor market from from wage formation to policy impacts and human development. Next, we will look at how these same principles apply to international trade. Uh, as I told you that economic theory suggests that if a minimum wage is set above the market equilibrium, it creates a surplus of labor. So, meaning more people are willing to work at that wage than employers are willing to hire. In simple terms, some workers earn more, but others may lose their jobs, especially in low-wage sectors like retail and hospitality. Let us take a real-world example, the U.S. in 2023. In 2023, the federal minimum wage in the United States remained at $7.25 per hour, unchanged since 2009. However, states like California raised their minimum wage to $15.5 per hour. What happened? According to the congressional budget, incomes for millions of low, according to the Congressional Budget Office 2021 report, a federal increase to $15 could lift incomes for millions of low-wage workers. But it could also result in the loss of about 1.4 million jobs, particularly among younger and less skilled workers. So the debate comes down to trade-off, higher wages for those who remain employed, but potential job losses for those pushed out of the labor market. Other economists argue that modest increase in the minimum wage have little to no impact on employment, especially in high-cost areas, pointing to studies that show neutral or even positive effects on local economies. In sum, the minimum wage remains a classic example of where economic models meet political and social goals, balancing fairness, employment, and growth. Let us now turn to international trade, a key area where economic theory helps us to understand how nations interact economically. Comparative advantage. One of the core concepts is comparative advantage. This means that a country should specialize in producing the goods or services it can make at the lowest opportunity cost, even if another country is better at producing everything. Example, if Sudan is relatively better at producing cotton and Germany is more efficient in manufacturing machinery, then both benefit by trading cotton for machinery. Trade barriers. However, trade is not always free. Governments often impose trade barriers, such as tariffs, which are taxes on imports, quotas, limits on the quantity of imports, subsidies, government support for domestic producers. These measures protect domestic industries, but they can distort trade flows, reduce efficiency, and increase consumer prices. Terms of trade. The terms of trade refer to the ratio of export prices to import prices. If a country's export prices rise relative to import prices, it can buy more imports for each unit of export, improving its economic welfare. For example, if oil exporting countries see higher prices for oil while the price of imported food remains stable, their terms of trade improve. Why it matters? Understanding these trade concepts help explain why globalization leads to interdependence, how policy decisions affect trade flows, and why trade can both help and hurt different sectors of the economy. So ultimately, international trade highlights the benefits of specialization sorry, and cooperation, but also the policy challenges that arise when balancing national interest and global integration. Let us look at a real-world example that illustrates the economic impact of trade policy. The US-China trade war, which began in 2018. The policy move tariffs. In an effort to protect domestic industries, the United States imposed tariffs, for example, a 25% tax on Chinese electronics and other imports. The goal was to reduce imports from China and boost American manufacturing. The economic theory, cost of protectionism. According to economic theory, while tariffs might temporarily support local industries, they distort comparative advantage and reduce overall economic welfare. Tariffs act like a tax on trade, making imported goods more expensive and forcing consumers to pay more or buy less efficient local substitutes. And the evidence supports this. By 2020, U.S. consumers had paid an extra $79 billion because of these tariffs, a direct cost of protectionism, according to the American Action Forum. This example shows that tariffs may protect some jobs in the short term, but they also raise consumer prices, hurt exporters due to retaliation, and reduce the overall benefits of trade. The US-China trade war is a modern case study that reminds us how trade barriers can have broad economic consequences affecting not just countries but millions of households and firms worldwide. Global supply chains, COVID-19 disruptions. Another powerful example of how international trade plays out in the real world is the disruption of global supply chains during the COVID-19 pandemic between 2020 and 2022. Lockdowns, border closure, and factory shutdowns across Asia and Europe disrupted the global flow of goods. One striking case, semiconductor shortages, essentials for electronics and automobiles, severely affected global car production, leading to factory delays and rising prices. According to economic theory, specialization and trade increase efficiency. Countries focus on producing what they do best and trade for the rest. However, this efficiency comes with a risk. Overdependence on a few international suppliers can create fragility in the system. After these disruptions, countries like Japan and the US began reshaping supply chains, investing in domestic production, and diversifying suppliers to reduce risk. Japan, for example, launched subsidies to shift production away from China and promote regional supply networks. This case highlights a key trade-off. Global trade boost efficiency, but resilience matters too. Countries must balance openness with strategic safeguards. Understanding the climate economy through economic theory. In this part of the lecture, we explore how economic principles help us understand and address climate change and environmental challenges. Externalities. First, the concept of externalities is central. When companies or individuals pollute the air or water, they impose costs on others, such as health problems or environmental degradation, that are not reflected in market prices. This leads to overproduction of pollution-intensive goods and underinvestment in clean alternatives. Bigovian taxes. To correct this market failure, economists propose Bigovian taxes. For example, a carbon tax that charges polluters per ton of emissions. This policy helps internalize the external cost by aligning private incentives with social well-being. Countries like Sweden and Canada have implemented carbon taxes with promising results. Tragedy of the commons. Another key concept is the tragedy of the commons. When resources like clean air, oceans, or forests are shared and unregulated, they tend to be overused and degraded because no one has an incentive to conserve. This explains the urgent need for international cooperation and environmental regulation. So these economic ideas, externalities, taxes, and common resources are not just theory. They guide real-world climate policy debates, from global agreements like the Paris Accord to national carbon pricing strategies. The carbon pricing in action, Canada's example. In this slide, we apply economic theory to real-world climate policy, specifically carbon pricing. Carbon pricing in Canada. To reduce greenhouse gas emissions, Canada implemented a carbon tax set at CAD $65 per ton in 2023. This is aligns with the tax concept or Bigovian tax concept. By putting a price on carbon, it makes polluting more expensive and encourages cleaner energy use. Between 2019 and 2022, Canada's emission fell by 6%, showing the tax effectiveness in reducing pollution. However, as theory also predicts, such policies can have distributional effects, raising fuel and energy prices for households and small businesses. This has led to public backlash, with movements like Yellow Vista Canada protesting the rising cost of living. This illustrates a classic policy trade-off. The environmental benefit comes at a short-term economic and political cost. In this part of the lecture, we will explore climate adaptation, how economics help cities respond to the unavoidable effects of climate change. For example, the real-world case of Miami. Coastal cities like Miami face rising sea levels and frequent flooding. In response, Miami launched a $4 billion resilience plan in 2024 to build sea walls, bumps, and elevate roads. Cost-benefit analysis in action. Economics tools like cost-benefit analysis guide these decisions by comparing adaptation cost, example, infrastructure, by the projected future losses, example, property damage displacement. So the goal is to minimize long-term economic damage. Miami's investment aims to protect $1 trillion worth of coastal assets, homes, businesses, and public infrastructure, highlighting the economic scale of climate risk. So adaptation is not just engineering, it is economic planning. Cities must act proactively, not reactively, to avoid catastrophic losses. Another real-life applications, renewable energy subsidies, balancing costs and cost. In this section, we focus on how governments use renewable energy subsidies to fight climate change and reshape energy markets. Case, the European Union's Green Deal 2020-2030. The EU's Green Deal promotes a shift from fossil fuels by subsidizing wind and solar energy. The goal is to reduce emissions, create green jobs, and enhance energy security. Example, Germany solar expansion. Thanks to subsidies, Germany's solar capacity grew 14% annually between 2020 and 2024, making it a leader in renewable deployment.